Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this fantastic launch of the supported landlord framework. I'm Michelle McKenzie and I'm the CEO of Shelter WA, and I've got the pleasure of being your host today. We've got a really big turnout, which is so pleasing. We know that there are people here from WA and a number of people from over east. I'd particularly like to welcome not only our presenters, but our members of the reference group who worked really hard with us to develop this fantastic product. And I'm going to name them: Catherine Morey, Sarah Toledo, Sean Kelly, Leah Watkins, Karen Edwards, Mariana Logan, Keely Moore, Leanne Parker, Louise Naylor and Tamara Belfield. With your absolute expertise and support during this project, we've got a product which is absolutely sensational. I'd also like to acknowledge Lottery West for their fantastic support and the grant that they provided, which enabled us to develop the supportive landlord framework. So just a bit of housekeeping. You'll be unable to talk throughout the webinar, but you can ask questions through the Q&A area, and these will be answered at the end of the presentation by our two superstar presenters, Michelle Shaw and Alison Patterson. In terms of the program today, I'll give a brief introduction. We'll go through the background and the context for the resource. We'll have an overview of the resource in terms of the navigation, the sections and the chapters, etc. An overview of what a supportive landlord is and the definitions and principles, the activities and strategies, the framework content, and how importantly you can use this during your work, your important work in the sector. So over to the introduction. We know that COVID has had a significant impact on all our lives, and we have changed the way that we work, socialise. It's impacted on all aspects of our life. During 2020, community housing providers faced many challenges in maintaining business as usual and protecting the safety and wellbeing of staff and tenants. Staff work from home, often with few resources, and rapidly having to learn new technology to communicate with colleagues. In terms of their conversations with us, we know they had difficult phone conversations with tenants to resolve complex tenancy issues in isolation without the colleagues and resources at hand. Routine property inspections and non-essential maintenance were suspended, and new procedures had to be found for sign-ups and vacating tenants. The WA COVID-19 emergency period suspended evictions, froze rent increases, extended fixed-term tenancies, and brought licence to occupy agreements under the temporary new laws. Community housing providers had to rethink how they manage rent arrears, property damage, antisocial behaviour, and multiple occupants with complex needs in lodging houses and complexes. The focus became more on prevention of issues, tenancy sustainment, and a light touch welfare approach rather than a reactive process. So in this context, and based on the feedback from our members, we applied for, and we were really thrilled to receive funding from Lottery West in April 2020 to develop this supportive landlord framework. And the aim is to help social and community housing staff to build skills to assist in the delivery of a supportive landlord service. And we were just so thrilled to have Alison Patterson and Michelle Shaw work with us on this project, and the stellar reference group that I acknowledged earlier. So we do know that community housing supports some of the most vulnerable members of the community in terms of housing and sustaining their housing. The term supportive landlord is often conflated with the role of a community housing provider, but we found that there is a little shared understanding of what a community housing provider is when they're meant to be doing and when they're acting as a supportive landlord. So the work that we did was talk to the chips to find out what they wanted or needed to understand about what being a supportive landlord was all about. The outcome was that the community housing staff said they wanted to understand the language, the context, the tools and approaches to being supportive landlords and ensuring tenant wellbeing and tenancy sustainment. They wanted to know when to refer tenants to support services and what the process and protocols were. It was clear that there were not and never would be social workers, and we needed to make that distinction very clear, but they needed to understand the language and context and key elements of what constitutes good practice. So we were very pleased, as I said, to have Alison Patterson and Michelle Shaw review existing supporting landlord resources and develop this concept that we've got today. And we had the reference group all along this journey. They're practitioners in the field saying, yes, no, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, really testing the product, which was very important. So now I have the pleasure of formally introducing Alison and Michelle. So Alison is the Manager of Community Services at Foundation Housing here in Perth. Alison has a Bachelor of Social Work and a Graduate Certificate in Social Impact from UWA. She has over 25 years of experience as a social worker in WA, Victoria and Hong Kong in statutory and not-for-profit sectors. She's also worked in child protection, aged care with refugees and migrants and with people experiencing homelessness in a diversity of roles. For the past 6 years, Alison has developed and managed tenant participation, support and capacity building programs in 2 large Tier 1 providers in WA, Access Housing, which is now Housing Choices, and Foundation. And we were just thrilled to have somebody like Alison with the absolute where the rubber hits the road experience working on this product. So it was centred in good practice and reality. Now, Michelle Shaw, she's the Business Improvement Policy and Compliance Community Housing person at Housing Choices here in WA. And Michelle has over 25 years experience in social and affordable housing in South Australia and the UK, and covering all aspects of tenancy management, including priority housing assessments, homelessness, debt recovery, tenant support, tenant participation and community engagement. Michelle started work with Access, which is now Housing Choices, in 2007. And being one of the largest community housing providers across the country, Housing Choices, she's really tapped into lots of expertise within her organisation. Michelle's been instrumental in the development of tenancy management policies and procedures, and her current role involves extensive knowledge of the Residential Tenancy Act and contractual obligations to ensure compliance, policy and procedural development and continual service improvement. So we've got 2 amazing women, 2 amazing practitioners with absolutely complementary skills that worked on this project. And I have the great pleasure now, and it's a pity we can't all hear each other and do a rounding applause, because I'm going to hand over to Michelle Shaw now, and she'll give an overview of the structure, special features and navigation of the Supportive Landlord website resource. Thank you. So over to you, Michelle. Hopefully everything's working. Thanks.
Working?
That's perfect. Yep, we can hear you.
Yes, you can. Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that introduction and the background to this project. Shortly, Alison is going to take us through the content of the framework and give a live demonstration on the web page. But before she does that, I'd just like to talk about the format of the framework and give you a showdown of some of the features contained within the framework itself and the sections. So we've got, this is what we're going to do just now, is an overview of the 4 sections, 2 in this way format, and just to have a quick look at how to navigate, a look at the summaries at the end of each section, and also the quizzes and the resource panel. So this is how it looks. So there's 4 sections to the framework, and the sections are each contained within their own portal. Now, Alison and I had this vision that we wanted to be all kept together within the sections. We wanted it to be easily accessible. We wanted the resources available very quickly and easily for readers to refer back to. And Heather Bush from Shelter has really taken our vision and turned it into an absolutely wonderful reality. So this is what you'll see when Alison takes us onto the website. It's the four sections, that's section 1 and section 2, section 3, and then section 4, tenant engagement. Section 3 is certainly the biggest section of them all, and the resources there you can see are quite a lot. Okay. Now the format that we've chosen for this is SWAY. And you may be familiar with SWAY, you may not, but this is why we thought it was important to just give you a rundown on it before we actually go to the website. Sway is part of the Microsoft 365 suite, so you probably have it already installed. Or if people don't have it, they can download it for free from the Microsoft Store. But it's really intuitive. It is such a visually stimulating tool. It's interactive. It contains a lot of features rather than just reading text. There's a lot of imagery, there's videos, there's audio, there's forms, there's quizzes, and it can be broken down into specific chapters. We have used this at Housing Choices as a training tool and received very positive feedback from staff on being able to take very dry subjects and making them almost fun. It can also be converted into a PDF or a Word document if you don't want to use it as a sway. So the portal, you can actually view the sway within the portal, and the top image there shows the sway being viewed through the portal. And it's not a good quality experience. The images are very squished, the text doesn't flow. So what we recommend is that you expand it out of the portal, and then the second image at the bottom of the screen, you will see that will be full screen when you experience it. You have a text on the left-hand side and the image on the right-hand side. And how you expand it, it's very, very simple. When you get to the portal, hover your mouse over the image and the little menu will appear. There's an expand icon, which is highlighted red there. You click on that and then it will actually go to full screen. You'll have a full screen. But you must remember to just let it load a little while. You'll see 3 dots come across the top of the screen. You must let it load, otherwise you'll get a bit of a disjointed image. Moving forward, it's very, very easy. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's arrow keys. You go forward, you go back. Very simplistic. One of the features that we really, really like about this way is that it has a home icon, contents. So if you click on that, which is ring red there, you come up with the bottom images for this particular section. So all the chapters are listed. Now, it's very important for us that this resource didn't become a static document that people read once and then it was never referred to again. We wanted it to be something that could be used in training and then also through a tenancy management operational stuff. So staff could actually go back to it when they had a particular situation or they wanted to download a particular reference or a template. They could go to it quickly and easy to the section and then to the relevant chapter. One of the things, the images, when you go through the squares, you'll see that there is, each chapter does have the image with the heading. And some people did say, oh, you know, what's the point of that? That actually puts the chapters in so we can have this lovely index. That's the reason for that. When the content is as long as it is in section 3, then not all the chapters can be seen. So you really have to use the arrow key, which is highlighted here on the screen, and then you'll get the rest of the chapters. There is a lot of visuals within the squares, a lot of content, but also a lot of visuals. What we're scrolling through now is cards. So rather than just present everything the same way, like text, image, these are just a different way of highlighting a process or key points. And so these are just cards. You just click on them with the mouse and you scroll through, and then you resume going back to the sway. In the sway, we're also using the images to run videos. So on the left-hand side, you've got the instruction that there's an image and you can watch the video, and then you click on the arrow on the actual image and it will play the video. The imagery is also used for reinforcement. So there are sections, the text will give a message and then the image will reinforce that message. For example, this one here is saying that when an external agency calls a case conference, tenancy risk is not necessarily main cause of concern. So that's that example. In this one here, there is an escalation process. Now that's described on the left-hand side in the text, and the actual process is the actual image, and that can be enlarged just by simply clicking on the image itself, and it will enlarge the text. The images are also used for additional information. So here we've got an explanation of an affirmation, and then we've got specific examples of good affirmations you can use. Again, the image is used here in a practical way. It is actually used to break down quite a complicated process in relation to scaling risk of tenancies, and this is the mitigation process. So the image it actually contains instructions and an example of how you can actually use that process. And finally, the last one is this is clearly a reinforcement of a message in the text. So we do use the visual images in a variety of ways. Summaries are at the end of every section, and they are really important. The feedback that we've had from users is that it really reinforces the key messages in the section. Some of the sections are very long, they contain a lot of information, and it is very handy to have these summary cards at the end just to pull out the key points. So the reader can actually say what is important, and if maybe if they've missed it or they don't understand it, they could go back to the relevant section. Each of the sections have a summary. And finally, we come to the resources. No, not finally, sorry. We come to the resources. The resources are on the right-hand side of every section, and they're broken down by the chapters. So they're very easily to access. There's an example coming up next. So in this example here, we're having a look at Bethany's sustaining tenancies policy. Now, I want to really stress here how generous the community housing sector has been in providing the resources and information for this. We have had so much information and resources, and they take so much time to produce in-house, and then there is this huge sharing. So it's been phenomenal. So here we've got Bethany's sustaining policy mentioned in the text. We just go to the chapter, click on the link, and it will take us to the sustaining tenancies policy. Very easy to use. And the last thing I just want to go through before Alison takes us through a live demonstration of it is the quizzes. There is an optional quiz at the end of each section. Now we actually use these in our training just to guide our training process. The feedback that we get from them gives us an indication of whether we hit the mark with the training, whether we need to do further training. So we use these and we actually record the results. These results are not recorded. It is purely for the reader. It's just a summary of some of the key points in that particular section. And once you hit submit, it doesn't really go anywhere, or it doesn't go anywhere. All it does is it will produce the answers. So if there's something that maybe you thought you got right and you didn't, you can then go back to the chapter or have a look at the resources in more depth. So that's an optional extra. And now I'll actually pass you over to Alison, and Alison is going to look at the content in detail and also give us a live demonstration on the website.
Thanks, Michelle, for that overview of the resource structure. I just want to acknowledge Michelle Shaw. She's been amazing to work with over this past few months. Her level of detail and her knowledge and skills around this in terms of the communication of all this resource has been extraordinary. So let's get on to the content development. So the content development for the 4 sections of the framework's been informed initially by the project scope, which Michelle Mackenzie referred to before, which was all about providing community housing providers with the tools and resources to be able to work as a supportive landlord remotely where required. But the content was also informed by the community housing sector, who said that they didn't want to be social workers, but wanted to understand key concepts and best practice approaches to when and how to link tenants to services. We consulted with some tenants, who I'm hoping are online with us today, who said that a supportive landlord the way that a supportive landlord communicates was a key part for them. The reference group, the project reference group, said there's a lack of definition about what a supportive landlord is or not, and given the absence of a shared definition, that this can create some confusion in relation to when and how, whether or not community housing providers or work as a supportive landlord, and what it looks like when they're doing that. So the content development had a focus on creation of a supportive landlord definition, and this has been undertaken in the context of some work that's currently being done by the Mental Health Commission review of the supportive landlord component of the independent living program, which is a bit of a mouthful. The Mental Health Commission are doing some work in this area as well, and I think we've got some Mental Health Commission reference group members in this audience as well. The content also focused upon providing a light touch to best practice approaches. So we've provided quite a lot of information about a range of risk assessment, tenancy management and support models, such as the stages of change, trauma-informed approaches, housing first and housing ready models, motivational interviewing techniques, how to be solution focused in a housing environment, and the support service systems surrounding social housing tenants. We've done this all without deep diving, providing just enough information to provide direction about where to go for further training if there's an interest. And we've written it more as an instructional manual rather than a research paper, and mostly kept the resources and references out of the main text, which have all been made available in the resource panel adjoining each of the sections. The content's also focused upon the development of and sharing of tools to enable consistency of service delivery, all of which are currently in use by some of the larger community housing providers who've generously agreed to share these, and Michelle's mentioned some of those before, but I just want to acknowledge them again. Housing Choices WA, Foundation Housing, Bethany and St George Community Housing are among the community housing providers who've shared tools and resources. Many of these kinds of tools help a community housing provider to undertake risk assessments to help inform their tenancy management decision making. And a key message in this resource is that the way that a community housing provider makes decisions about sustaining or ending tenancies can be defining, because this is how a community housing provider weighs up the sometimes competing priorities of achieving business sustainability with the social impact of allocating housing to and sustaining housing of people who have complex needs. And lastly, the content has a focus upon communication, what and how to communicate with tenants about tenancy management and tenancy risk, which includes how to have difficult or uncomfortable conversations, how to communicate with someone in distress, how to ask questions using a person-centred, strength and solution-focused approach, how to communicate, intervene depending upon the stage of change and level of motivation for a change that a tenant has, as well as how to create solution-focused tenant support plans. So we're going to go and have a look at the website now. Now, this is not the website, and I've got everybody's in my way. But we'll go into the website and hopefully this will work. Wait for it. So this is the website. So I'm just going to move. I'm not sure what people can see or not see, but I'm just going to move everyone's faces out of the way. So this is the way that the supportive landlord service framework looks like on the Shelter WA site. You can see it looks really lovely, and again we thank Heather Bush from Shelter for making it look as lovely as it does, I think. So there's an introduction, there's section 1, section 2, section 3 and section 4. Now the introduction and background, you've got a couple of key quotes on the top here. One from Sean Kelly from Bethany, but I believe Sean Kelly should be congratulated on a new role that he's got at Community Housing Limited. but when Sean was a key member of our reference group, and he phrased the quote, "All community housing providers were adequately resourced to do so should be working as supportive landlords." And also a tenant who we consulted with provided this quote: "A supportive landlord should listen and communicate with their tenants in an effective manner. They should be able to offer advice as to what services the tenant might need and enable the tenant to use these services," which I think goes to the need for communication, resources around communication. So the background and the introduction has already been covered off by the two Michelles, as well as some of the navigation, the instructions around navigation. This is the introduction, which actually, using Michelle's instruction, needs to be extended, and the introduction will provide quite a bit of the information and that Michelle Mackenzie and Michelle Shaw have already provided. So I won't go into that in any great detail there. Section 1 is, so we've got the 4 sections. Section 1 is all about definitions and context. So again, going up to expand it for premium viewing experience, and going into the contents icon, you can see that section 1, which is all about context and definitions, has 4 chapters. It's got one about housing providers, looking at the compliance environment that community housing providers operate within, looking at toward a chapter on supportive landlords, and looking at the definitions and key underpinning principles and activities and strategies of a supportive landlord, and then of course the summary card. I just want to, so you can see that when you enter into the sway, again, it gives a lot of comprehensive instructions around how to navigate through the sway, which I would really highly recommend people look at and look through. Now, I'm not going to go into the way, because there is a huge breadth of content in this resource. It's hours and hours and hours of reading and churning through and dipping in and out of. The way that I'm going to approach looking at the content is I'm going to have a look at the chapters, show you the chapters that are in each of the sections. Then I'm going to go into just 1 or 2 chapters just to demonstrate what that information looks like and how it's presented, and then maybe go into the resource panel to see where the resources are linked. So for section 1, I'm just going to have a look in an overview approach at the supportive landlord service chapter. So what we're looking at, the supportive landlord service chapter proposes a number of key underpinning principles of a supportive landlord service. It describes a number of key strategies and activities which are specific to the delivery of a supportive landlord service, and suggests a broad definition. And I say suggests because this is our version, this project's version of a supportive landlord service definition, because there isn't an agreed one across the sector. We look at complex tenancy issues and the differences between complex tenancy issues and what complex a person with complex unmet needs is, and that informs our first underlying principle, which is that a supportive landlord service prioritises the provision of affordable and sustainable housing to people with complex needs. We look at tenancy management decision making as a key aspect of this resource, and our second key principle, supportive landlord service principle, is that a supportive landlord service fulfills an essential safety net role for tenants whose tenancies are at risk and who have disengaged from support services. As I say, there's lots of content which I'm not going to deep dive into. The supportive landlord service, we also look at housing first, housing ready, housing support and program swapping at a very light, in a light touch way. And it leads into our third supportive landlord service principle, which is a supportive landlord adds value to both housing first and housing ready programs, because it enables person-centred, flexible support delivery over the long term, enabling a tenant to remain housed in place while the support is moved to where it is most needed by moving a support program and not the tenant. We look at the principle of separation of landlord and support and suggest a number of ways in which a supportive landlord service is supportive without being a support worker in the traditional sense. And we propose the argument that leads into our fourth principle, which is that not all the work to maintain a tenancy looks like a support worker, because a supportive landlord service does a whole bunch of things to help maintain tenancies. We look at the different risk factors that are involved in that key crucial decision-making moment where a supportive landlord is making, a community housing provider is making a decision about whether or not to sustain or end a tenancy. And those risk factors are risk to the landlord, risk to the tenant, and risk to the community. We go through those in some detail. And we talk about that in tenancy management decision making, that not all different landlords are going to weight those risks very differently across both sustaining a tenancy as well as ending a tenancy. And we go into some detail about that. We propose that our fifth supportive landlord service principle is, though, that supportive landlords will use discretion when enforcing their legislated powers, weighting the social impact or individual wellbeing risk to the tenant and community of a tenancy management decision over the commercial risk to the landlord. We talk about problems and we talk about in section 2, we'll talk about different kinds of problems, and we talk about complex problems, and that complex problems require collaboration. And this leads to our sixth principle, which is supportive landlord service prioritises collaborative approaches such as case conferences and partnership development. We provide a model that's being worked on by the sector over the last couple of years, and it's been referred to in the West Australian Association of Mental Health review of personalised support linked to housing report from a couple of years ago, and that has a number of other principles there, which I'm not going to go through, but I'll leave you to have a look at. We suggest a number of activities and strategies of a supportive landlord. And finally, we have constructed a fairly broad definition here, which is a supportive landlord service is the range of activities and strategies that a housing provider undertakes when providing and maintaining social and affordable housing for people who would otherwise have barriers to accessing and or maintaining accommodation. A supportive landlord service includes a range of both landlord and person-centred support linked to housing activities and can be delivered by any housing provider or landlord where there is an aligned strategic purpose and or adequate resourcing available. So just to pull out of section 1, there is a quiz at the end of section 1, and there's a summary at the end of section 1 to help with the navigation and the reinforcement of learning in that section. And the resources and links, if you go over to this section, you'll see that any of the resources that we've referred to in the context in that can get accessed through that, through remote links. Going into section 2 and using the same approach as I've just done, we'll have a look at the chapters. We're going to have a look at the chapters. We're going to let it think for a minute and have a look at the chapters. So there's 5 chapters in section 1. And as I say, my face is getting in the way of a lot of this. 5 chapters. There's instructions again at the beginning of at the instructions for navigation. Now, tenancy risk assessment chapters are assessing tenancy and individual wellbeing risk, how to have difficult conversations with tenants, collaborative decision making using case conferencing, and remote supportive landlord management. So again, just going into assessing tenancy risk, for example, as an example chapter in terms of the breadth of the content. Looking at this, we first look at the importance in a risk assessment of determining the difference between an immediate risk versus an ongoing risk. And we provide a couple of resources which are the provided by Shelter Queensland and the West Australian Network of Alcohol and Other Drug Agencies, which both have crisis response pathways for those community housing providers who may not have either a duty of care or incident response procedure that they have that they're actually working on. So after we've determined if it's an ongoing or acute risk, an immediate risk or an ongoing risk, we start talking about that risk assessment can be done across all stages of a tenancy, at the beginning of a tenancy, during a tenancy, and at the end of a tenancy. And that risk assessment, but when you're actually undertaking risk assessments, it's really important to, in any risk assessment, to be clear about what actually constitutes a risk, who or what is at risk, and what assumptions this belief is based upon. And as an example, there's some nice little research that Leah Watkins has put me onto, which suggests that some risks in relation to readiness for housing, for example, should be used quite judiciously, because there is some research that suggests that there isn't a good they can't always be tied to tenancy failure, those particular risks. Tenancy failure or returns to homelessness, particularly when support is available to the prospective tenant. I touch on the vulnerability, the VISBDAT, or the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritising Decision Assistance Tool, which some of you will be very familiar with and others not, perhaps. But it's not a risk assessment tool per se, but it potentially is useful at the beginnings of tenancies in terms of those community housing providers who want to make decisions to provide housing to people who are the most vulnerable. During a tenancy, it's the role of a community housing provider community housing provider to sustain tenancies, and tenancies become at risk because of antisocial behaviour, rental arrears, poor property standards, and changes to tenant health and wellbeing. And what we've done is we've got about three templates for risk assessment tools that are currently in use across the community housing sector. For example, this one, which is Foundation Housings, has something called a traffic light system, which assesses risks across a number of what we call positive tenancy domains, which are stable, safe, connected, equipped, and healthy and empowered. And these are all aligned with the WACOS outcomes framework from 2018. And there's a template for that available in the resource panel. We've also got Housing Choices WA's tenancy risk assessment, which looks at rental arrears, property standards, antisocial behaviour, and tenant health and wellbeing. And I'll show you that one in a minute. And we also look at St George's Community Housing Vulnerability Assessment Tool, which is also a risk assessment tool. We look at how to look at risk, which is looking at both the likelihood and impact of risk. And that's it for the tenancy risk assessment tool. So you can see that it's quite a breadth of content, and that's the same across pretty much every one of those chapters. I want to just show you the resources that are available now in the resource panel in terms of assessing tenancy and individual wellbeing risk. There is this one, for example, emergency response to behaviours of concern, that provides a lovely little decision-making pathway. There is the Housing Choices, which I'll have a look at. Is that the one? I'll give you this one, Housing Choices WA Risk Assessment Tool. This is a nice little interactive tool. Again, this is one that Michelle Shaw has created herself, well, in my time when I was there. And it has a lovely little, you go through each one of those risk areas, and it gives you something that you need to do, a course of action. So these are all tools and resources that can be downloaded and in an open source way. Okay, this is the largest section, section 3, which is tenancy risk assessment, just tenancy risk management. Again, looking at that one, going through the chapters, there are, and we'll just let it think for a minute because I think I'm going a bit quickly. There are lots of chapters in this one. There are 12 chapters across a bunch of different things, and let's have a look. We'll just go through those chapters. So the chapters include decision-making pathways, strength-based tenancy support, planning, which includes a focus on outcomes. It looks at trauma-informed tenancy support. It looks at First Nations tenants trauma reconciliation. Michelle Shaw's going to hate that particular slide, I can tell from here. We look at stages of change, 5 strategies, motivational interviewing, person-centred approaches, strength-based and solution focus, property standards management, antisocial behaviour management, and managing financial risk. So obviously I'm not going to go through all of those with you, but I just wanted to have a look at tenant support planning as one of the chapters to give you a bit of an overview. So the tenant support planning chapter looks at a particular kind of tenant support planning model, which is used in housing choices and foundation housing. And this tenant support planning model looks at what are the issues, what's working well, and what needs to happen. It has an outcomes focus, and the outcomes that we look at outcomes to the tenant, outcomes to the community, as well as outcomes to the community housing provider. So you can see that you've got to be very clear about what outcomes, what difference we're trying to make, and for who. It provides a bunch of examples of different kinds of outcomes that can be looked at within tenant support planning. We have a focus on trauma-informed tenant support planning. This is really crucial. I suppose one of the key messages that I would say is that I wanted to convey with this is that it's really important that tenants' experiences of trauma can make it really difficult for tenants to engage with problem solving about their tenancy in a time frame initially expected by their housing provider. So timeframes are really important when you're looking at trauma-informed tenant support planning. We've got, so we go into a bit of how a tenant might present to a housing provider in relation to if they've had an experience of trauma, what that might look like. We give a bit more information about that, again, within a housing context. We look at First Nations tenants, trauma and reconciliation. Clearly, this is a huge issue, and certainly community housing across WA will be housing lots of people with First Nations who are First Nations tenants, and this is a very concrete, real issue for everyone. We've provided access to the Noongar Cultural Framework and Housing First Principles, which is actually accessible in other places in the Shelter website, but it's a terrific cultural framework for how to think about training, and we provide a few other additional resources. One of the key messages that we have in the tenant support planning chapter is this, which is that working within a trauma-informed approach should change the way we think about tenant engagement, rather than thinking that a tenant has disengaged or is not engaging. The onus is on the community housing provider and the tenant support providers to become more flexible and innovative about the ways that they are trying to engage with the tenant. With engagement, it's not the tenant, but the strategy being used that needs to change. We've got a nice little case study that we provide of best practice case example in my view of Rua's Wongi project, which is a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive engagement approach, and we provide a bit of detail around that one. So that is just tenant support planning, and you can see that there are lots of other bits. Just from a very practical point of view, I wanted just to show have a look at property standards, though, because I know that it's this is where it all breaks, because we're looking at it too much. No, it doesn't want to do it. Michelle, I don't know if you can help me with that one. All right, we might get there. For some reason it's not going there. It may be that other people are in there. I'll just flick through some of this, which is around the solution-focused work, and go into property standards. So property standards chapter, we look at possible causes of property standards, intervention strategies. We look at hoarding specifically, we look at family and domestic violence impacts on property standards, and we look at the support service system around it. There's a whole bunch of, we provide a bunch of different causes, and also then provide some possible intervention strategies depending on those causes. So different causes for property standards will require a different intervention approach. We look at the support service system around property standards. We of course look at NDIS, and we look at My Aged Care. But we also look at families, and the key message for me in terms of looking at families and property standards is that there is almost nothing in the support service system that provides practical support to families around property standards. And I think that needs to be really, really understood clearly. There is nothing. There are support assessment and referral services. I don't want to diminish that. There are mentoring services, but there's no practical support in the same way that's delivered, say, through the NDIS or My Aged Care, who's somebody who literally comes in and cleans the house. For struggling families, they don't get to have that kind of service. And there's some gendered conversation I think that we can have about that and the lack of support for women in particular, but I won't go there. I'll provide a case study around the First Nations Homelessness Project, which I think is a really excellent, culturally sensitive approach to dealing with property standards issues, chronic property standards issues for First Nations families. First Nations actually have lost their funding in June this year, which I think is a travesty. And First Foundation, for example, are currently in a fee-for-service arrangement with First Nations, and they're just achieving some amazing results for some of our families. We look at hoarding, so we go into looking at hoarding behaviour. There's a lot of information about hoarding. I'll just go back to that. We provide a managing hoarding pathway, a hoarder screening assessment form, a clutter image ratings scale, all in the resource panel that all can be all downloaded. We look at the Buried in Treasures program, which is a local hoarding intervention program. Then we look at FDV and property damage and what that looks like from a housing provider's perspective, and provide quite a bit of detail. So that is just, all of the other chapters have the same kind of range of services, the range of approach as does that one. Now, I'm conscious of time, and I'm just going to, because I know that we might have a few questions. I'm not going to go into great detail about the fourth section, which is about tenant engagement and participation, and I'm going to allow people to have a look at that in their own time. I think I'll just have a look to show you the kinds of chapters that we've got here. We've got drivers for community housing providers in terms of undertaking tenant engagement participation. We're looking at best practice approaches. We look at what tenant engagement is, what tenant participation is, because that's different. We look at the benefits of providing tenant engagement participation. We look at the different kinds of participation that can be offered. We look at the challenges, and also we look at organisational readiness for providing tenant participation. And that's the broad overview of the content that's available here in this in the supported landlord service framework. I wanted to go back to Michelle. Michelle, I don't know if you wanted, Michelle Shaw, I don't know if you wanted to join me now in this conversation about sector application. If you can unmute, that would be really good. So Michelle Shaw and I have had a bit of a conversation about how this resource can be used in the sector. As I shuffle through papers, I don't know if you want to start me off and so I can have a drink of water here, Michelle.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, I mean, Alison has a phenomenal amount of information in this framework, and my role in this was to cast a sort of a tenancy management operational view over it, and also from a training perspective in being able to turn some really complicated concepts into something that could be easily understood by staff. And the target group originally was for frontline staff and managers, but Alice and I have sort of, thought, well, actually, it has a broader potential to actually let other agencies have a greater understanding of what community housing providers do and our different approaches. So yeah, I mean, it's for me, when it is a really good training tool, both for induction or for ongoing training, and then as an ongoing resource. I mean, there's over 100 resources, so they're all brought together in one place and in a structured way. So it's very good from a training point of view. But again, it does rely very much on the organisation, and their strategic direction and the resources available to them to then guide staff. But it also allows staff with that amount of information, and it's sort of a basic understanding and awareness. It's not in depth, as Alison has said. It is a basic understanding, but there's just the ability then to take areas of interest, even for professional development, and run with that. But for me, it helps staff, if they have that basic understanding and awareness and knowledge, then they can participate, meaningful in discussions, workshops about policies, policy reviews, about policy change, about strategic direction. So yes, it has heaps of benefits in that regard, Alison.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I'd agree with that, all of that. I think that the thing that I would say to add to that would be that the reality is that in order to implement the full range of the activities and strategies that we've described, would be, you've mentioned it, very much dependent upon resourcing available and the community housing provider's mission and strategic alignment, and to create a high fidelity supportive landlord service which encompasses all these activities, strategies, skill sets, would require additional resources for a community housing provider to do all of them. So the idea behind this is not to be a prescriptive model for community housing providers, but rather to enable community housing providers to select the guidance and tools that suit their own housing practice and their legal and contractual obligations. But the importance of organisational direction in relation to frontline staff is really important. Frontline staff can't do this stuff if there isn't strategic direction around whether or not, how much commercial risk can be absorbed or not, how much, if there's a reputational risk in terms of evicting a family or not, the organisation itself needs to actually provide that guidance to frontline staff. And on that, I think we've got 1:25, Michelle Mackenzie. I'm not sure if we've got much time for questions, but I'm very happy to take some if we want them.
So we've got some questions in the chat, but I think Alison and Michelle, your fabulous presentation has covered most of those, and any of the kind of more technical ones I've responded to. So conscious of time, so I might wrap up, and knowing that this is recorded and people are probably really keen to dive into the actual resource. So just in closing, I'd like to thank everyone who attended today. It's great to have you join us. Again, thank Alison, Michelle, the shelter team, Heather Bush, who's been sensational in terms of, I didn't know what a sway was. I thought it was a Hawaiian palm, but I've learned so much through this project. And the reference group, and it was remiss of me not to acknowledge the tenants that were involved in the reference group. It was really important that they help keep it real. Also, I'd really like to thank the community housing providers who shared their resources. It's a really generous gesture around the common good of the sector. So some of those larger providers, sharing that with other providers is just fantastic. As mentioned, this is available on the shelter website, and one of the things that I think everyone was really thrilled about is not only the framework, which kind of makes providers think about risk and their role as a property and tenancy manager sustaining difficult tenancies, but it's just got these amazing practical resources like how to, you can download X, Y and Z, which is just great. So it's not just conceptual, it's a real doing thing. And Michelle Shaw, who does the training, made that real, which is just great. We're really blessed to have Paula O'Leary work with us, and we're giving some thought as to what we can do to support the sector who might need more support than just having the staff go through and do this self-paced kind of learning and deep diving. So we'll give some thought to that and hopefully get back to the sector on that. But just in closing, I forgot to acknowledge that I'm on Wajak Noongar country, so I just wanted to really acknowledge that we're on traditional land here, and that many First Nations people are often disadvantaged in housing markets because of the colonisation that has happened. So hopefully that this resource with its really fantastic reference to Noongar Maya and the great work they're doing can help us and our sector support First Nations people in getting better housing outcomes. So thank you. Thank you for the really positive comments. Hopefully this is useful and this will help you in the work that you do. As a peak body for social and affordable housing and ending homelessness, our aim is to support our members and the broader sector deliver great housing outcomes. And I think the resources that these two superstar women have put together hopefully will help you with that. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and this is available live now on the shelter website, so enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you.